Good morning, good morning. This is the fourth episode of FAFO and Chill, in which the Chainstack Developer Experience team talks about the various things that we've been building and exploring within the Web3 space over the past few weeks. In classic Web3 fashion, we spend a lot of time exploring new Web3 technologies and building various tools. FAFO and Chill is where we talk about these things and dive into the world of Web3 tech. Today in specific, we're talking about developers.ethanfrancis.app, an application that I released just a few weeks ago that goes through different blockchains and counts the number of unique contributors within each ecosystem. This app got a lot of really great attention on Twitter, from the Avalanche community and the Solana community for its nuance in that you can actually scroll through repositories that it's scraped and look through a number of unique committers that it's gathered from a kind of complicated algorithm. But we'll get into it and talk more about how it all works and how we've been leveraging this for internal things at Chainstack, as well as how potentially you can check out the website and use it for some pretty cool insights into the Web3 ecosystem. Usually we have three main speakers, myself, Ake, and David. Today, Ake is out at a Web3 event. So number one, we have me. My name is Ethan. I go by the alias Tabasco. I'm the developer relations lead here at Chainstack. And with me, I have David, our developer advocates lead. So what's up, David? How are you doing?
Hey, Ethan. All good. How are you? Yeah, it's good to take this time to have a chat about all the FAFO that we do. It's kind of the relaxing part of the week.
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited. I think the conversation today will be pretty good. We're going to start by talking about developers. I can't think of a good name for it. I call it, in my head, I always just call it developers, but I know that's not like a specific enough name because that can mean a lot of different things when you're just saying it. I guess in this case, we can just call it, let's use the term developers, but it refers to the website, the full URL, developers.ethanfrancis.app, which is what we're talking about today. So David, have you had a chance to use the application? Because, I guess throughout like the past few months at Chainstack, figuring out where the ecosystem is at in terms of numbers and in terms of, how active it is and how many developers exist on each chain, has been a big challenge for us because of course, this is a key component of Chainstack and that we want to know, how many people need infrastructure. I mean, this is like the baseline of how we make a lot of big decisions. So for a long time, we were just like, well, we can use Electric Capital's report and like maybe that's decent. But we didn't quite completely understand how many people needed high quality Web3 nodes and subgraphs and whatnot until we started working on this tool to kind of, we'll get into it later, but index GitHub and get a pretty decent insight into at least open source contributors in Web3. So have you had a chance to go on the website? And if you did, what were your immediate thoughts of those numbers?
Yeah, I've been checking it out lately, and I remember when you came out with this the first time a while ago when you kind of shared it a little bit under the radar, and I was like, wow, that's a really good way to do it. On my side of Chainstack, I haven't been too much into this, let's check the numbers of developers and such, because I take care more of the background stuff, documentation and so stuff like that. But then once you show me that, I was like, that is a really good way to solve the problem, or rather to have at least find some good data source that doesn't rely on a third party. And I thought it was pretty smart using the GitHub in the repositories like this. It should give us a pretty good insights and about trends and things like that. So I thought it was pretty good. Every time you come up with some ideas, I'm like, how did you even think about that? It's so simple but so effective. Like
that's the philosophy of developer experience at Chainstack, right? It's minimal effort,
for real,
maximum result with achieving that through the FAFO process.
For real.
And that's kind of what we did here. And of course, we've gone through a lot of examples with the past few episodes of like things that we built, things that you have built, things that Ake has built, that are great examples of, like FAFO and Chill as as a process, if that's what you want to call it, or like maybe an idea. I'm not sure the exact term that you use for it in this context, but I guess for some additional context as to exactly what we're talking about. Yeah, so for some additional context as to exactly what we're talking about, like I mentioned a few months ago, specifically when it comes to developer relations, we wanted to find a way in which we could match the results of our developer signups of the things that developer relations managers were doing with the actual number of developers in the ecosystem, right? Because if you look at, for example, as an infrastructure provider, we use a lot of KPIs based on like signups, right? So like the number of developers that we have using Chainstack, right? This is kind of like a natural way to see interest being drummed up for the platform and people actually using it. So, if you look at just, oh, wow, we had a 15% increase in Ethereum signups, which we actually, we do have a really great month-over-month increase and stuff like this. But the issue there when you're looking at KPIs for developer relations is that, okay, well, we had 15% for Ethereum, theoretically in this case. And, is that all developer relations? Did this one developer relations manager get us 15% more Ethereum signups? Did they get us 500 Ethereum developers? Well, that's a stretch, I think, in this case, because that 15% can come from a ton of sources. Most importantly, it can come from a general fluctuation in developer base, right? So if we see that a huge event happens and Ethereum developers go up, 3x, right? And we go from 3,000 Ethereum developers to 9,000 Ethereum developers in a month, right? Well, then now we have a huge margin for potential impact to our platform, right? Because now if we've 3x Ethereum developers in the ecosystem, then all these Ethereum developers, they need infrastructure. So naturally, some percentage of them is going to come to Chainstack and use our infrastructure. So this is where we needed to solve this problem. And we're like, okay, well, we can't just assign a percentage number to a developer relations manager because that's an there's no tie there because of market movements and the way that the developer ecosystem shifts. So we said, okay, well, let's figure out how many developers there are. I mean, it's simple. If we can understand the actual change in developers every month, right? So if we can say, okay, well, we had 15% this month, but Ethereum went up 25% in developers. So, finding that proportion to that, we call it the growth impact, right? So if Ethereum goes up 25%, on average, we'll have some impact to that, right? So some percentage of those new developers will use Chainstack and sign up for Chainstack. So we call this proportional growth impact. And it can get really complicated. We can't put this whole system for developer relations because developer relations KPIs historically are very difficult to nail down. But in the effort of trying to, at the baseline, figure out, well, what's the change in developers every month, right? Is there more developers in Ethereum? Is there less developers in Ethereum? Because then you also have the issue of like, well, what if we only did 2% on a certain protocol this month, right? Well, also just like a 15% month, you can't attribute that all to a developer relations manager because if we went down 15%, then you have to factor that into the, of course, proportional impact to usage and number of signups to a platform like Chainstack. And this goes for a lot of Chainstacks, right? Or a lot of platforms like ThirdWeb and these different like developer-facing applications that rely on new developers coming in as a primary business model. So the answer to this was, well, where are most developers, right? Where's one place that most developers are? That's GitHub, right? I actually don't have most of my code in GitHub. I probably have 5% of it. I stray away from GitHub usually just because I like closed source. I know that's not a very popular opinion in Web3, but I do like, at least with my personal applications, usually they're like security sensitive and there is like some level of importance in terms of not keeping it open source. But still, like the majority of Web3, like Web3 developers, and I think Dave, including you, like, would you say most of your like main projects they are on GitHub, right?
I think so, yeah. I only have really 2 or 3 repositories that are private, just mostly because the code in there looks really ugly. That's really the main reason.
Yeah. That's another reason why I don't put stuff on GitHub. It's just lots of spaghetti code. You should have seen the first big project that I made, the first version of Amity. Oh man, that code was really rough. It was not I think it took 1.5 minutes to get the balance of an account because the code was so inefficient and it was terrible. But anyways, so
you had to start somewhere.
Yeah, like yeah, that's how it is. At least it worked. That's what matters, right?
Yeah.
So most developers are on GitHub. Okay, we've established this, right? So you say maybe 70% of developers in Web3, 80% maybe are on GitHub. The rest are building stuff locally and maybe on like Replit or whatever, non-open source typically. So we know this. How do we know how many developers are really on GitHub, right? So the way that we did this was, and the general idea here, and to be honest, I wasn't the main proponent of this idea. This was like a whole collaborative effort with the Chainstack team, Ake, Juan, and a number of other got even some feedback from the Chainstack executives and our CEO JJ and stuff like that. We had a lot of really great feedback in terms of how we get these numbers and how we can get to this endpoint in which we can actually implement it on a KPI level. But the kind of general idea here was, well, we could look at code, right? We can look at different code within different repositories and look for certain flags, right? So if you're building something on Solana, for example, you're always going to be importing a certain package, right? To actually use Solana, to connect to Solana, to use whatever adapter you want, there needs to be an import in your code that specifies that you're importing something from the Solana library, like their main like host name or whatever. So this is like, for example, this is the flag that we look for in the flag in Solana code. We look at, well, let's find code. Let's search for code on GitHub that matches a certain flag. In this case, it's importing a Solana package, a Solana related package, right? If they import it, then it can be reasonably assumed that the package or the repository in this case connects to Solana, right? This is like an assumption that like 9 times out of 10 is true, that when you see an import statement in the case of Solana, in a code that imports a package that is relevant to Solana, they use Solana. So through this alone, through only looking through imports, we found, I think it's close to 7,000 Solana repositories on GitHub, which is crazy. So it looks at the code. If it matches a code flag, it looks at the repository and adds the repository to the list. It's super simple. It can get more complicated. Maybe we can talk about it later. But at the base level, that's all it does, right? It looks for code flags. If the repository matches it, then it adds it. For EVM chains, it's stuff like chain IDs, right? So, I don't remember the Avalanche chain ID off the top of my head. It's some big long number. It starts with 4, I think. But it looks for that, right? It looks for, well, in the code, is there a variable declared in which Avalanche chain ID, right, is attached to that, right? So at some point in the code, did they declare chain ID equals 1? If they do, then they're probably using Ethereum somewhere in their code. Or is it 137 for Polygon? Or is it 56 for BSC, right? These are different things that you can look for. And again, that same assumption, you say, well, if it's in the code, we can reasonably assume that at some point here or there, they connect to that blockchain. Now for EVM, this comes up with a lot of multi-chain projects, stuff like that, naturally, because that's just, how EVM is. But still, from this method, from looking for flags that can, with a high likelihood, indicate that a repository probably connects to a certain blockchain, you can create huge lists of developers and repositories that connect to blockchain. So like I can open up the numbers here. I think we're talking about this before the podcast today. Those like for Ethereum or for Avalanche, it's already indexed over 11,000 repositories, which is insane. If you open the list on the website and you scroll through it, it's crazy. Like how many repositories are there? Like 11,000 as a number. Just hearing it doesn't sound super crazy. But when you actually look through those repositories and think each of these is a piece of code that somebody has written and connected to the blockchain with, it puts into perspective, like there's a lot of building happening in Web3. There's a lot of things being created. For Solana, it was 6,500. Same thing for Arbitrum, a little over 6,500, about 7,000 for Polygon. So this is a lot of data. And essentially from this data, what you can get is a number that we call unique committers, right? So David's a unique committer. I don't know if I'd be counted as a unique committer because I only do private repositories usually. But people that do public repositories that contribute at some point in the last few months, or at some point in the last 30 days specifically, that make at least one commit to a public repository that connects to a certain blockchain is a unique committer, right? So, let's say David creates a wallet, a Web3 wallet, right? And he does 6 commits to it in the past 30 days. That's one unique committer, right? and then let's say I do another one and I do 12 commits to another repository that I create, I'm another unique committer, right? So these, you count this up, right? You say there's this unique committer, you can use the word contributor. These mean the same thing in this context. And then at the end of this whole calculation of saying, well, this repository has these commits, there's this many people doing these commits, add it to the list. And you go through all the repositories, in Avalanche's case, all 11,000 repositories, look at each commit and count each unique contributor. And now you have a cool number, right? We call this number unique committers, which is a fancy way of saying, it's a safe way of saying active developers, because you can't know for sure that all these people are active developers, but realistically, that's what it means. It means that these are people that are building on Avalanche or building on X chain, whatever chain you want to talk about, in the last 30 days that have created a commit. Anyways, I've been talking for a long time. But this is the general idea of how it works. We talked about the numbers briefly, but the post I made was about Avalanche, or at least it got popular because of Avalanche. The Avalanche community picked it up, and because it had 1607 unique committers. So 1600 unique committers on Avalanche the past 30 days. It's now at 1726 after I made a change to the indexer. So this is pretty cool. I mean, I think when you're just in the ecosystem, it doesn't feel like there's that many developers. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Do you agree with that or disagree with that, David?
Yeah, it's difficult to say because in the communities maybe around, I don't know, on Twitter or whatever, you cannot always see the same people. So it's difficult to see, a lot of the real numbers. And then, as you were saying, many people probably commit to maybe private repositories and stuff that we don't see on chain. So those are big numbers. Yeah, when you came out with those for the first time, I was like, oh wow, those are some big numbers right there. I was not expecting it, to be honest.
Yeah, you made a good point in terms of like when you're on Twitter, it really is the same people. Like I feel like I see the same 15, maybe 30 people every single day, like the same developers. It's like there's this guy and there's this guy, and it's like, oh, I know this guy, and it's very rare that I come across like a brand new like full stack Web3 developer that I had never heard of before, because it feels like a small ecosystem. But when you take a step back and you look at these numbers, I think the issue is that we did talk about this briefly on the last podcast, but with Web3, most people don't have time to be a full-time developer or to be full-time at all, because most people are still stuck in Web 2 doing their Web 2 job or whatever. So when you look at it like, well, I only see 120 people show up every day and participate in the community, but there's 1,700 developers here. Like where are they? Right? They're not on Twitter. They're not participating. And I think it's more so because it's much easier to contribute one time, maybe 3 times, 4 times to a Web3 repository a month versus being full-time in the space. So showing up every single day, being on Discord, being on Twitter. That's something that a lot of people just don't want to do, or don't have the time to do. So I think that's where we get most of the numbers from. And it's pretty crazy to see. I posted it on LinkedIn, and I got some comments like people saying, these numbers seem really low, and they're like, what's happening? Like, these have to be wrong. These numbers are low. And I was like, really? I thought these numbers were a lot. and most of these were from like non-Web3 natives. So I think there's a disconnect almost, and like Web3 natives underestimate the amount of developers, and people outside of the space that maybe aren't as like directly involved in kind of the developer ecosystem tend to overestimate the number of developers. They think there's more than there actually is, which is an interesting dynamic. Usually you'd think that it'd be the opposite, especially with like the reputation that Web3 has in fintech and the different industries as like being this dead, But
yeah, this is actually kind of interesting because we had a conversation last week with a platform that is that produces educational content, mostly for Web 2. They don't really have any Web 3 content yet, so we are exploring possibilities to work together for this. And one of the questions they asked was something like this, like, what about the illegal part? And I was like, they were very upfront, like, hey, we are not used to this. We don't understand anything about this. This might be like a weird question, but what about the illegal part? I thought that was pretty funny. Coming on that.
Right. Yeah, it's a big, like I was trying to get money into crypto the other day. It's so weird, like the whole space and the legal part of it, and like the fear that everybody has, and especially like the government, and like the SEC
Yeah.
in specific. I was like, I wanted to get some USDC on chain the other day
Hmm.
through Binance US, and I remember it was like Binance hasn't had USD deposits for like months now. For like what is it? It's like
Oh,
35 days at this
yeah, I
point,
heard that they were struggling.
which is
Yeah.
it's interesting because it's like these like Web 2 institutions are super anti Web 3. But at the same time, they seem to think that Web 3 is a much larger ecosystem than it actually is. And of course, it's not a small ecosystem. I mean, this is an ecosystem worth billions of dollars at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But still, it's like, when you compare like even just market caps or like general utilization of Web3 versus like most of the industries, it's just so minute compared to even like small fintech industries or like sub industries, stuff like that. It's crazy. So I think to kind of wrap back around these numbers, to me, I was super happy about. And at first, I was like, and we also talked about this briefly, but it was like I thought they were wrong. I thought they were. I was like, I must be double counting or something. Like there must be something wrong with the code where I'm like I'm counting too many people, because there's no way there's these numbers are so high for each of these chains. But I changed it. I changed the code over the weekend because I made the tweet on Thursday, and it got 75,000 impressions and 90 likes or something, and I was like, okay, deep breath. I got to make sure that this is accurate, and I'm not like like
These numbers are real. Yeah.
right, that
That's
I'm not
funny.
like giving fake numbers to all these people, and like they're all like liking it, and like, oh, this is look at all these developers, and like I'm sitting here with bad code, and I was like, oh man, I have to make sure this is really important. So I took
Now
the weekend,
some
and it's the biggest fear of everybody, right? It's like your application is
now
incorrect or
some
illogical,
VC is gonna dump tens of millions of dollars because of that,
right?
because of your application,
Yeah,
and then they're gonna lose it all.
throw it all in avalanche. So
Yeah.
I took the weekend, and I was like, okay, I need to read through every piece of code. I need to look at the entire line of logic because honestly, like this code, like most of the backend stuff on this application, I had written months ago. Because I wrote it, I created the application, and I dropped it, and I never really went back to it because I was like, I gave private access to certain people and did that kind of thing. But it honestly just stood dormant for a long time. So I went back at the code, and I read it over the first time. I was like, I don't know what I did here. I have no idea how this works. Because it happens all the time. You write code, and like you look back at it a few months later, and it looks like I don't know what happened. So
That happens
I
to
was
me
like
in a matter
copying
of
it.
days.
Yeah, yeah. It looked at your PR, and I was doing that with the faucet the other day. I was looking at my PR, and I was like trying to track it. I was like, what did I write here? What? And I found all these issues, and I changed it. Um, yeah, so I took the weekend, and I looked through all the code, and I pasted it all in ChatGPT, and I was like, explain this code to me. Explain what I did here.
What did I do?
You know,
Tell
right?
me.
Yeah. What does this variable do? Why did I write this? And it's helpful because it knows like what these different things do, and when it's like hard to maybe see the immediate use case. And like I mean, with my code, I do like improper variable naming and all these different things, and it makes it even harder for me to like see it after the fact. So I did it, and I looked through all of it, and I realized on Saturday, I was like, oh no, I actually am double counting. It was true. I was double counting. I wasn't double counting everybody, but what it was doing is that initially the 1607 number for Avalanche and for every chain was that it was doing it on a per repository basis. So the scope of the list of unique contributors was out of scope. So it was actually only it was on the repository level, which means that if I commit to your repository, if I commit to the faucet, then I commit to my own personal repository, and then I also in the same month commit to an Avalanche repository, right, on the official Avalanche GitHub. Then that's 3 committers that it just counted. It counted for each individual commit that I made to each of these repositories. It counted me as a different person for each repository that I committed to. This is a huge problem. I saw it and I was like, oh my God, these numbers are totally wrong. I've been misleading everybody. This is not good. So I was like, okay, this is bad. And then I also realized in the same moment, I was like, wait, how did I miss this? I looked through the repository list as well, and I was like, this list is a JSON key pair format, which for, if any of you guys are technical, you realize the problem with that. If you're not, basically the problem is that when you're storing a huge list of repositories in a key pair format, right? Meaning you have a name and you have the key or the value, right? So in this case, it was the name of the repository and then the link to the repository. The issue with this is that if you want to add a new repository that has the same name as one already on the list, it won't do it, right? It messes the entire thing up. And now the list is like, it's just, you miss a ton of repositories because of that, because you're adding based on repository name, not on repository link, which is a huge problem. So I was like, okay, well, I've just found two major issues with my code. This is terrible. So I was like, okay, I need to do two things. I need, number one, change at the foundation of how the committer counting works. So there's biases here. So I ran through the whole thing in my head the other day, and I was like, it was a whole thing. So I was like, well, the number of committers that it's counting is over bias, right? So this means it's counting too many. It's counting more than it needs to. But the number of repositories that it's counting is under bias. So it's not counting enough repositories, right? So this creates an almost clashing sort of bias, where it's like, you have too many committers, but you also have not enough repositories. So what does this mean? It means that, maybe the numbers are accurate. If there's a clashing bias here, if there's too many on one end, not enough on the other end, then maybe there's something here. And I was like trying to justify it all to myself, like, man, these numbers are wrong. These numbers are wrong. And I was like, okay, so I made the change and I ran it all through and I changed the entire format of the repositories and how all the committers were counted. And then at the end of the day, the numbers were actually more than they were before because of the lacking repositories. So it's really interesting because, I saw this problem and I was like, okay, I way overcounted. There's probably way less developers. I probably overcounted by hundreds. And then, once you actually make the change and fix it, right? In this case, it was changing the format from key value on repositories to just being a list of links, to with the committers making the scope, meaning if I commit to repository A, repository B, and repository C, that's just one person rather than three people. Even then, with these changes, because I'm shifting the biases, right? So I'm doing more repositories and less committers versus the ulterior was this, right? More committers, less repositories. So when you shift it completely the other way, you actually get very similar numbers. So we saw originally with the previous somewhat flawed mechanism, the avalanche unique committers was 1607, right? Today, with, I think it found over 800 additional repositories at 1726 with the change. So this is huge. I mean, I think this is a good example of just like, when you're building things, a lot of time you can very easily make conclusions of like things that went wrong and how they went wrong and like the result of fixing it. But in this case, it was like almost not obvious that the numbers were, I thought they were too high because they were counting too many committers, but the numbers were actually too low than what they should have been. So this is an interesting thing. And I thought this was like a kind of unique case of just like, I mean, it was FAFOing. It was a lot of FAFOing over the weekend, but it was
exactly what FAFO brings you.
Right. It was, here's the problem. I got to come up with a solution. And the solution was actually, I'm happy that the numbers are higher because it means that it wasn't a lack of, the excitement was actually reserved over what it should be because it just, there's actually 100 more on a lot of these, especially for Polygon. Like Polygon was significantly less. And now it's like 2,100 unique committers, which is crazy. And this is with like a functional, tested and reviewed format for getting committers. But anyways, I've been talking for
and it's interesting because Polygon is showing about half the repositories than Avalanche, but more committers.
Right. I think over anything almost the balance of repositories to committers is interesting because there's only 7,000 Polygon repositories, but there's 2,100 committers. But on Avalanche, there's 11,000 repositories and 1,700 committers. So this means that the projects that use Polygon on average have more people contributing to them than those in Avalanche. Same thing with Solana, Arbitrum. I mean, you can make the same kind of balance
Yeah.
percentage number to each of them. But anyways, there's been a few cases like that. We've built a few tools over the past few months, like the ChatGPT plugin, which we're actually releasing today, like making a piece of content about it today, as well as a few other things where it's like, there's been times where it's there's been a huge issue and it's like, don't know how to fix it, and it's finally here's a fix. And I think I guess maybe one of the best, I guess there's two, like the faucet has been kind of a journey of that exactly happening. Like, here's a problem, like we need to fix it. Like the first one was the transaction receipt. Do you remember that?
Yes, that you solved in what, 5 minutes?
It wasn't just me. It was me with the help of many ChatGPT instances and Replit windows.
That was funny.
The solution.
Like, oh, we need to improve this.
Yeah, it was,
and then 5 minutes later, oh, here it is. Okay.
Yeah, it works. It works well.
Whatever works.
Yeah, that's all that matters, that it works and it's functional. It's better because with the plugin, or not the plugin, the faucet. The issue is that we were correct me if I'm misremembering, but the transaction was waiting until that transaction was actually confirmed until it returned the hash. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes. I think what was happening is that the script was sending the transaction and then it was waiting for it to being indexed. So I don't think it was waiting for the actual confirmation, but it was waiting for at least being indexed or picked up, by the other nodes. So yeah, that was creating quite a bit of a delay depending on the net, how busy the network was, and that was causing all sorts of other problems because the transactions were slower to be sent out, and then our backend also had to maintain Nginx open for longer and all this type of things. It was risking to getting timeouts and stuff like that. The interesting and really bad UX part on that is that even if if it was timing out, and so the front end maybe will receive an error, say, hey, something went wrong. The front end doesn't handle these timeout errors. We should probably add something about that, but just say, hey, something is wrong. And the funny thing is that the user would be like, oh, it didn't work, but then the transaction is still going because it was just our backend that was not picking it up. They didn't pick up the information,
Right.
but the transaction was already sent, and so the user will receive the ether anyway. But now it's much better. Now we're picking up
It sends it
directly.
immediately. Right.
Yeah, now we're picking up the transaction hash immediately without the waiting for it to be indexed or broadcasted or all of these things. So it's much faster.
Right. Yeah, I think it cut the total time, like the time from requesting the faucet to getting a receipt from, what is it, maybe 4 or 5 seconds to like less than a second, which is great because, that error was a big problem. And a few other problems that caused was making the faucet like not super user friendly. So it was a pretty easy fix. I mean, we just changed the return on the receipt to be as soon as the transaction is signed and pushed, it actually already generates a hash, right? So you don't need to wait for it to be indexed before the hash is returned. So we had it return it immediately as soon as it's pushed. And then also in the backend, what we have is it's returned, and we also have a stopwatch that goes and it says it's going, 1 second, 2 seconds, and then if it prints as soon as it's confirmed or as soon as it's indexed, right? As soon as we have the receipt indexed, we also have like the actual faucet was requested. We gave them a hash in, let's say, half a second, and then we got the receipt, the indexed receipt in 2 or 3 seconds. So it's pretty cool how it works. And that was a big change. And that's just, just that on top of, we talked a lot about this in the last episode, but the spam protection on the faucet, the drain fix, and even like some stuff with the plugin. There's a lot of things that you come down that like issues that you find and like you think like, oh, this is like, we messed up, like this is a big problem, we need to fix it. But actually when you fix it, right, and you change it, you're not only just fixing a problem, but the application is actually a lot better, right? So it's faster, or it's more accurate, or it, has more functionality sometimes. Like we saw this a lot with the plugin, the ChatGPT plugin, when, it was like, well, this method doesn't work, so let's replace it with this method. And that actually resulted in a better, like more complete response that was faster. So, it's stuff like this where it's like at least my general philosophy, especially like after doing the whole thing over the weekend and revamping the whole website and like its architecture, because I was worried about the accuracy of the numbers. This at its core is like problems like these are usually good things, because it means that if you have no problems with your code, then it's either you're not looking hard enough, or it's already perfect, which is great, but it's very rare that it is. So looking for issues like this, right, and trying to find holes in logic or in the code itself, and then fixing them has reached past just the issue itself and into the actual efficiency and the quality of the application. And this is something that we see repeatedly all the time as we FAFO and as we build different things. So yeah, the developers at developers.ethanfrancis.app was a pretty cool thing. I wasn't expecting to get that much traction, but I'm glad that it did. I think it was a pretty successful application, especially because it's valuable, but also it brings a lot of value in just that you click on it and like you can learn more about Chainstack directly through the website and stuff like that, which is pretty cool too. So, anyways,
Yeah.
that
Are
was
we gonna are we gonna include it somewhere in on our on the Chainstack site, or on the developer portal? Do you have any plan on that?
I think, I talked briefly about it with Eugene, like, what if we included that onto chain stats, like the numbers at least? Because, what I was planning to do soon actually was create an API out of the website where you can pull historical numbers, right? So you can say, what was the unique committers for Avalanche a month ago? What was it 2 months ago? Or what is it right now, right? How many repositories has it indexed? And that way you can actually integrate the data from this website without having to go to my, kind of janky website into your application. So you can go to Chainstats, for example, and we can throw that into an API there. And then we can say on top of, like Chainstats is really cool because it lets you see blockchain size and stuff like that. Maybe we also somewhere include like the number of developers by each chain. Just an idea, but
Yeah, that'd be cool.
having some of that natively in Chainstack would be definitely pretty cool. And I have the API on my to-do list, so we'll see at
Nice.
some point.
And so the next question is gonna be, when do we have developers AI?
Yeah, somebody on Solana, I'm in a bunch of Solana builder groups, like developer groups, and I posted it in there, and a few days later, this guy came back and he was like, yeah, I created this AI chatbot for the Solana repositories. So chat with repository, which is interesting. And he said, or chat with repository list, more specific, where
Okay.
he took the entire list of Solana repositories and gave it to ChatGPT basically, and you can say, what's the repository link to the Metaplex Candy Machine repository, which is like this
Nice.
NFT thing on Solana, and then I can give it to you, and it's pretty cool. So we were just talking about this before the podcast today. Dave and I were on a call, and we're just like, the amount of applications that can be built with AI and with, like you see the new Versal SDK and the ChatGPT, language model itself, when it comes to using that as an API and stuff like that. It's crazy, like the amount of possibility that's there. There's so many things you can build, and like we've been building a lot of stuff. Like we have the Chainstack AI that we're working on. Maybe we'll have a public demo soon. I don't know how close we are to that.
We can do it.
You want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I feel like this is keeps being kind of the same, same things that you hear all the time, and then you just repeat them. Like, we have this website to talk to our documentation, and this website to talk to our repository and things like that. But these applications really open a big big use cases. For example, we have this MVP where it indexes all our documentation and you can chat with it and ask questions. It's still a little bit buggy. You have to be very over specific in the questions that you ask. So requires some improvement, but you can virtually add this type of content to literally anything. So yeah, I think we should add something like that to Chainstack, and maybe if we include your application in there, we should definitely have some sort of AI interface to do something like that and say, hey, what are the repositories here? If we find a way to put numbers somewhere that the AI can access, then we can also ask for statistics and things like that. So that would be pretty cool. On the Chainstack AI side, yeah, we're as you said, we were talking about it. We'll need to brainstorm some ways to add some good value to this application. But it is a fun project for sure, and we'll try to make it nice. And we were saying with this AI craze, like there are so many possibilities, and then we have tools like the Vercel SDK that they released not long ago, or LangChain. They make everything so easy that you can build one of these applications in minutes. Of course, it's not going to be as optimized maybe, but it's crazy, and you can do it for everything. For example, one of the ideas that I have that I keep working, during weekends and stuff like that when I'm not doing Chainstack stuff. So I have an aviation background, right? And one of the big things about aviation is it has a lot of technicalities, has a lot of stuff to read and study, and a lot of the stuff is boring. When you are not talking about some cool stuff like, I don't know, aerodynamics or how system works, a lot of the aviation side is regulations. Regulations are written by lawyers. They are super important. You can lose your job, you can lose your life if you don't follow those. They're really boring to read, they're difficult to interpret. So one of the things that I'm thinking is, why don't I try to index the whole regulations, or all the aviation regulations, and then you can just ask questions to an AI about it. So those are, to go a little bit away from Web3, but those are all the type of use cases that we can use, and that's why it would be interesting to be able to have Chainstack do stuff like that. What we would like to do is also, besides indexing, Chainstack documentation, it would be cool to have Web3 specific repositories indexed in there. I don't know, the Geth repositories. You want to know how Geth works, then you just ask questions about it. This just requires a little bit of work because, as I mentioned, the tools are good, but you need to tweak them a little bit to get good responses and making sure that the AI doesn't invent things and stuff like that. So it requires a little bit of work, but we'll get there.
Yeah, that was a huge challenge with the ChatGPT plugin. That actually we faced a lot, not even just like the covalent side of things, but just in general. So like ChatGPT and most language models in general are they're good when they have limited context. So if you give them too much information, they lose their mind basically. They have no idea what's happening. They just start making things up out of thin air. Even if you tell it, don't make it up, a lot of time they will, especially ChatGPT that has access to a lot of information. So this is a problem with the plugin that we are making, which the purpose of the plugin is to create an interface for Web3 data readability, right? So to be able to say, what NFTs does this wallet have, and what was the latest transaction that it did, and how many transactions were in the block that the latest transaction was included in, complicated stuff like this. So we needed something where it could get a response of hashes and numbers and things that needed to be extremely specific, and then not make it up. And this was a huge problem. This took us a long time to solve because, we'd ask it and it'd give us the correct response, right? And then it would just make it up. It would say, well, it sees the numbers, but it just doesn't understand for some reason. And then it says, oh, well, the hash is this, and that hash doesn't exist. Or it says the value was 10 ETH, and it was well, the value is actually 0. So, it's interesting how it does it. So the way that we got around it was primarily, we figured it out where we can format it and kind of change the questions and the information that it gets in a certain way for the general blockchain calls. So for things like, get block by number or get block by hash, which the plugin can actually call natively. We figured out a way where it can get almost always the information pretty reliably. And if it doesn't, then we give it like parameters it can use, and it can get complicated. But those work pretty well, and it almost never hallucinates those. But the problem that we ran into was with our Covalent integration. So we wanted to integrate the Chainstack Covalent SDK into the ChatGPT plugin, so that it could do like other data tasks beyond RPC calls, like getting NFT metadata or tokens for a certain address and so on. So we did it and we implemented these things and tried it, and it gets this huge response because Covalent has a lot of data, and it gets this massive response, and it usually actually fits within the limit, but it's so much data to where it just starts making things up. So you say, what tokens does it have? And it has no idea what the answer is, even though it has that information with it. And we found the primary reason for this was actually because that it was being given data in a JSON format. And this is really interesting. That may be only interesting to technical people, but it was, I spent all this time on like the OpenAI forums and on Reddit and trying to find answers to the question of like, why does it hallucinate so much with long responses, right? It's weird because I was like, how do we fix this, right? Because we still need to get the data. We need to get the response, but it can't make things up, right? Yeah. So what I found is that people figured out that for some reason, ChatGPT, when it's reading JSON, right? So like lists and dictionaries and stuff like that, and key value pairs and whatnot. When it reads this, it has a significantly harder time understanding it, and thus a higher chance of hallucinating than if it's just reading like text, right? So if you just say, in text, not in JSON, value colon 0, right? And that's just in text. It's not in JSON, whatever. That's just like, and then below that you have address, and then that's the address, and you just have this and it goes down. This, for some reason, ChatGPT doesn't hallucinate with. So it was, that's a simple fix, right? We just take every JSON response that we get from Covalent and we turn it into text, right? Just like very human readable text. There's no formatting or anything. It's very simple. And for some reason, when you give it that, the same amount of data, same amount of characters almost always, versus JSON, it all of a sudden understands one and doesn't the other. So we did that. We implemented this JSON to text feature in all of our Covalent responses, and now it's really cool when you ask ChatGPT, and this is what, when you look at like Web3 enabled plugins, this is a problem that almost everybody faces. It's like because Web3 data is complicated and it requires a huge degree of like specificity that ChatGPT struggles with a lot. But I think we kind of cracked the code here in some cases where it's like, it can do it, right? It can, if you ask for a block information, or if you ask for balances or token balances or NFTs, it can give you that data super reliably and almost never hallucinates. So, but it was funny. I was recording the showcase video for the plugin last night that we're actually going to be posting a few days before this podcast comes out. And I re-recorded it maybe 2 or 3 times, and I fixed things. I made PRs to the repository, and I kept realizing these issues that popped up. Because it was, it was hallucinating every now and then, but I fixed all these things, and it's, to figure out the limitations of ChatGPT, you'd actually use ChatGPT, and once you start using it enough, you'll start to realize, okay, this is not. It's cool for like certain things, but ChatGPT and GPT-4 in specific has some very serious limitations. So it's like you have to intentionally work around these things, like tell it not to do this and to do that, and give it very specific context formats and whatnot. And this is what we did with the plugin. I think this is another challenge for us with the Chainstack AI that you've been building, David. It's like we need to figure out like how, and we were talking about this earlier today, but like I guess the main issue, and maybe you disagree with me, but the main issue for this in terms of like accuracy is trying to figure out the way in which we provide it with context. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think on that specific kind of application, at least how it's made now, it is just an MVP and it's very basic, but at least how it's made now, hallucination is not a problem because it's using the vector DB QA chain from LangChain, which specifically only picks up the context from the vector database. And the prompts that are built in tell it also, if you don't have the context, just say that you don't know. It specifically says not to hallucinate, because that's a problem. It's these GPT models are a little bit too creative, I guess. So I think that side of the hallucination, I think, is not going to be that big of a problem. The problem is when you have a lot of data, how to make it get the right context in the right place. Because what I was mentioning in the index in the documentation, we have about 3,600 vectors coming off the Chainstack documentation. Each vector is basically should be around 250 tokens. So it is a lot of data that is spread through the whole vector database. And how this integration works is that it's gonna find the context, and it's basically gonna return a certain amount of the findings that it finds us. I'm using find word a lot, but it's gonna return a certain amount of context, and that's depending on how you set it up. So we can set it up to make it return the first context that it finds, or the up to 5 or 10 or whatever. So the problem there becomes that at some point it's going to have so much data that maybe it gets confused. It's picking up different things, and maybe it's too many tokens. It's something that I actually found out. Ideally, a bigger number, it's better on this context retrieval, because it means that it can retrieve more things. The problem is that maybe it returns too many tokens, and so it starts getting to that limitation. And so, yeah, that's going to have to be a fine balance of understanding where the context is, or something that we'll probably have to do is becoming more proficient with how these vector databases work and how the systems work, so that we can chunk the total amount of data in smaller parts and divide it. And maybe we have a specific database for, like, I don't know, this is this part, this kind of documentation, I don't know, reliability stuff is on this side, and blockchain development is on another place, and API is on another database, so that, and then we implement some logic where somehow it understands where to look. Actually, this is a good idea. We were talking about that earlier, like, hey, I'm not quite sure how to do that. Why don't we try to do this? See? We're FAFO in live.
There you go. Yeah, we have a solution, or a perspective solution. A lot of time,
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a solution.
Python is the key to, LangChain, or however you pronounce it. I know you made a lot of stuff. You made like a bunch of tutorials with them about like their stuff, and that's such a cool repository, or like package for stuff like this, and for sorting through information and kind of presenting as context. So it's cool to see your recent like articles over there, and they've been like retweeted by LangChain and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, they've been retweeting almost. LangChain has been retweeting almost all of them, and some of them I have like 20,000 impressions on Twitter that I would not expect out of my 200 followers. Some of the articles have like 2,000 views where they're hosted. So it's it's nice to see that they actually interact with the community like that. And it's such an interesting package for these things, because it really condenses a lot of code in just a few lines. You can literally, with the Python package, you can literally make a chat application, I don't know, in 15 lines of code, maybe even less. If you cut down all, the intermediate extra stuff that are not necessary. But yeah, 15 lines of code, and you have an application that can run on your, on your personal data or whatever you want to do. I'm finding it just difficult to find a good balance, because their Python package is really good. At the same time, the front ends that I'm trying to work with is Next.js, TypeScript, the Vercel AI SDK, which makes the whole streaming part very simple. So for streaming, we're talking about when, instead of waiting for the full response to come back, it's taking, every time there is a new character coming in or new token coming in, then it's going to display it. So it's a little bit better UX. But I'm sure there is a way to do it with the Python side. I didn't look into that yet. It's probably much more complex than it would be with JavaScript or TypeScript at the moment. So we're finding these little limitations. The LangChain package for the JavaScript side is still a little bit limited. It doesn't have all the functions that the Python side has. For example, that simple app that I made, where we kind of do the same thing. We index the Chainstack documentation, and then you can ask questions to it. That one is done with the Python side. It has more of like a chat, uses more of like a chat methodology, and it somehow understands the context a little bit better, for example, than what we did with the JavaScript side now. And that one is much more reliable. Like if we could find a way to use that as an API and have a fast response to the front end, then we will have the work like 80% done, because that package by itself is already pretty decent. So as usual, we'll have to FAFO a bunch and try to understand how to do things properly.
We could also figure out like actually getting the streaming to work in a Python-based web framework. I know that it's like native within the Versal SDK, but I mean, if using Python is so much better for reliability and stuff like that, then maybe it's worth exploring that.
Yeah, I think it would be worth it.
And trying to create a similar front end.
Yeah, and then it would also be easier to control it, and it will be easier to include the rate limiting that we want and stuff like that.
Right.
Because there are all these other small things. For example, one thing that I'm struggling to wrap my head around is what happens when many different users get onto that same, in the same page, and they ask different questions. How is that going to be handled? And we'll have to figure out also these things, these type of things.
Right.
It might sound a little bit on the noob side on the web development, but I don't really have much experience in that. So it's all things that I'll have to figure out.
Yeah, it'll be good. It'll be good to FAFO the way through that, and then hopefully come out with a pretty solid product. I think the Chainstack team and the DevEx team and whatnot, we've been pretty excited for the possibility of like leveraging AI in a way that, like, number one, we can use for conveying information, right? So like the documentation, we have this huge docs page, right? And if anybody listening to this hasn't gone through it, there's some really great tutorials. There's all this awesome like API information about Web3 infrastructure and Chainstack, right? But to actually parse through it and understand it, you have to manually read through it all, which is fine. I mean, this is how you do it traditionally. But AI and like this application that we're building, what hopefully the goal of it is that you have all this awesome content that's been written by the Chainstack Developer Experience team, and now what you can do instead of like having to manually read through all of it and understand it, is you just ask an AI, a language model, right? And it knows what you need. It can go get the information that we've already written and find it and then present it to you in a way that's understandable and like digestible. So this is like number one use case for us is that we have all this really great technical and educational material that just needs a vessel almost to be conveyed in potentially a more digestible format. Number two, it's like actually working with Web3. This is what we're doing with the plugin, right? So it's like, actually making JSON RPC calls, making calls to the Chainstack marketplace integrations, or even at some point, like managing the Chainstack platform itself. These are all things that are also enhanced by AI. And it makes it a little easier. It streamlines the process, right? Without having to, create a JSON RPC call in code, or, going through a block explorer and figuring out all this information manually. Then you can just write out a question and ask ChatGPT. I mean, this is something that was never possible before that all of a sudden you can now do, and it's routed directly to Chainstack nodes. And this is really cool, at least in my opinion. Maybe it's a kind of a nerdier thing that most people aren't super excited about, but I think that this is a really insane evolution just in terms of like data accessibility, right? And like information accessibility. I think especially in the case of, the plugin and this AI, the documentation AI are really great examples of that, right?
Yeah.
Data accessibility, information accessibility, these
Yeah,
are
I think
the key components of it.
I think that a really cool part of this, and I've been using these type of tools for so much lately, and even to just learn new things. Let's say that you go through one of our tutorials or guides about, I don't know, get logs, and you don't understand it. Let's say that it's written in a way that it's maybe not as understandable, then you just put it in ChatGPT or a similar tool and say, hey, can you explain me this in a different way? You can actually do these type of things, and that's, I think, what would be cool to have on our platform, that you can actually kind of chat with our guides and like, hey, can you explain me more context into this thing, or can you show me some more use cases and more examples? I do this all the time when I'm trying to learn something I'm not 100% sure of how to use it. I just put in ChatGPT and say, hey, how do I use this concept in the real world? And this, I think, is an approach that helps quite a bit understanding new things and new concepts, and we should definitely try to leverage that. I remember when we were talking to the Learn Web3 guys, that they are implementing also their AI stuff, and I was like, oh, I wasn't expecting you guys to implement this, and they were like, well, in our opinion, Web3 is not only blockchain. Web3 should also be this type of AI stuff. So I think that's pretty much where we're gonna go. Everyone is gonna have access to these type of things, and then every application and every platform is gonna try to integrate it somehow.
Yeah, I hope so. I think, the Learn Web 3, I think they call it, maybe if they call it Bug or something like that.
Oh yeah,
Their AI, I don't remember. It's something along those lines. They have like a name for it.
yeah,
And it's cool because you can ask it questions about the material on the website. It's just, that's like a perfect example of like using it for educational stuff.
yeah,
Because, like at Chainstack, we run a lot of Twitter spaces with organizations that create complicated products. Because, I spend all my time on the infrastructure side of things, on RPCs and subgraphs and API and stuff like that. So like I try to explore as much of Web3 as I can, but I say this all the time, but like nobody is a master of Web3. Nobody is, because there's just too much. There's too much information. There's too many different technologies and things working together that it's so difficult to like have even a basic grasp of every single concept of Web3 and how it all fits together, and even how it works like on a technical level. So all the time, when we do spaces with somebody that has a project that like, I need help understanding, like Cartesi, for example. These guys do like this EVM virtual machine, I think like Linux based, So before we did our space with them, when I do Twitter spaces, I want to know exactly what the project is, and I want to know that for the purpose of making my questions engaging and relevant to them. I don't want to ask them like, tell me about your project and like what's in the future for your project, and what can holders expect. I mean, that those are super like generic questions. I like to actually ask questions about the technology and learn more about it from them. So, but before doing that, of course, you need like a basic understanding of things. So, like with Cartesi, I took their white paper. I took like the first few pages of their white paper and I threw it in a ChatGPT. I said, explain this to me like I'm 5 or like I'm 10 or something. And it gave me a very simple breakdown, and I understand like the role that it plays. And I did all of this, and I said, I asked questions about it, and it's perfect for stuff like that. It's like, I can read through the white paper, but there's a lot of things that I don't understand, and it's like I kind of get this, but I kind of don't. So that's where the magic of language models and AI integrations like this come in.
yeah.
And I hope that our the Chainstack AI and the ChatGPT plugin that we're releasing soon will both be hopefully useful for the community, and that will achieve these things of enhancing knowledge accessibility, information accessibility, as well as data accessibility through things like JSON RPC calls and stuff like that. So anyways, these are all exciting things, right? Today we talked about a few key projects and things that are happening within the like Chainstack Developer Experience team. Number one that we discussed was the developer information, the developer activity website that I created and I released last week. Just kind of an interesting experiment and something that we created for Chainstack that the community also found really useful as well. The way that it all fits together is kind of interesting and just a cool practice. And here's a problem that we need to solve. We need to figure out how to measure developer activity, and here's a solution. Let's just like figure out what works best, and talk to different people and get different ideas and then implement something. And we also like talked about the importance of like making mistakes almost and like fixing them, but also fixing them in a way that like enhances your application, right? So like with the developer information thing, I made mistakes with that, but at the end of it, I realized that the mistakes weren't as big as I thought they were, and that after solving them, after fixing them, it actually made the application way better, way more reliable, way more accurate. And we've done this in many cases with things like the faucet and with the ChatGPT plugin. And like, if finding an issue in your code or in your application, it's always very important to like just fix it and fix it in the lens of seeing it as an improvement rather than like, well, here's a huge problem that, we just need to like patch up and leave it. Because it's almost always an opportunity to like create a better application out of it. So this is like a key component as well. We also talked a lot about like the different AI platforms that we've been working with, and the Chainstack documentation AI and the plugin that we're releasing soon. So there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening on kind of all sides of the developer experience team here. And we're excited for anybody watching today, as well as developers in the future, to get hands on kind of some of the tools that we're building and things that we have planned for the next few months. But other than that, I think we kind of reached the end of the hour here. David, any final thoughts or any last topics you want to touch on real quick?
No, I think we covered a lot of stuff, a lot of fun stuff today, and don't be afraid of finding mistakes before someone drains your faucet.
That's important. That's
wisdom.
Fix it before the issue occurs. But even then, the draining is a good example of like, even though it was drained and we didn't catch the mistake before it happened, after fixing it and after doing all the things that we did with it, I don't think there's a better faucet on the market, if I'm being completely honest, in terms of like general accessibility, and like not having to do all the Twitter verification, like all of the
exactly
super complicated over the top things that all these different faucets require you to do. Being able to like just get a key and place it in there, and like for most people not even have to get mainnet balance checks or anything. Like we created a pretty killer faucet out of the whole thing. So just another example of kind of the philosophy that we're talking about here. But yeah, that was FAFO and Chill episode 4. We release FAFO and Chill episodes every single week. This is, like I mentioned, the 4th episode. You can check out our episode last week in which we talked about more about the faucet drain. So we touched on it briefly here, but if you want to learn more about how that happened and the nuances of that and kind of the lessons that we learned in that case and the things that we built to solve it, you can go to episode 3 of FAFO and Chill. It should be in the same playlist that this video is included in. And also, if you want to check out our previous episodes 2 and 1, you can do the same thing, go through the playlist, or save this on Spotify if you're listening on Spotify, or save the playlist on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. We release these every single week.